tremendous size. Yes, isn't it?
Ready when you are.
Brush up your Dylan Thomas, pass round the lava bread, and take in the gorgeous Welsh scenery in this week's I'll Explain Later, the Doctor Who podcast that's going out with Trisha Delaney, with your hosts John West
and Matt Needer. Tonight, the Slitheen are back, and they are swapping farts for fission thanks to the fastest green light ever given to a British nuclear project. Can the Ninth Doctor heal a truly destructive rift? And what happens if you inspect the TARDIS's crack? We head to a middle-tier bistro and raise a glass to Boomtown.
And the Third Doctor raids the dressing-up box while the brig can't stop huffing fungus. Meanwhile, a lovely green space gets littered with condoms, which truly thrills the hearts of a pair of Londoners like us. We rush to complete our books on self-actualization so we can fully succumb to the Green Death.
Hello, John. How you doing?
Oh, well, Matt, how are you?
I'm all right, thanks. I'm all right. And hello, listeners. Hope you're well.
Yep, both of you.
Hope this podcast finds you well. Series 3, Episode 3, Week 3. This bold new experiment in
the power of 3.
Podcasting slightly more frequently than we used to. Yes, the power of 3. And to celebrate, we are not reviewing the power of 3.
No.
We are reviewing 2 stories that are linked by their
South Wales location.
South Wales location, yes. I mean, sort of by dint of the fact that, like, all of Doctor Who by default is, shot in Wales these days. But
yeah.
These are 2 stories that put Wales and its people up front and on screen from very different eras. So we're going to start tonight with Boomtown, which is the 11th episode of the 2005 series, Christopher Eccleston series, the very first of the modern series. John is rapidly tapping into Wikipedia as we speak. He'll chime in shortly with an actual transmission date.
Oh, right, okay. 4th of June 2005.
4th of June 2005, thank you. And drawing on a few threads from earlier in the series, the TARDIS, with its occupants, the Ninth Doctor, Rose Tyler, and Captain Jack Harkness, head to present-day Cardiff, where, as we discovered a few weeks earlier in The Unquiet Dead, there is a rift in time and space, which is, when they park on top of it, is a very useful way of refueling the TARDIS. In the meantime, Mickey, Rose's on-off boyfriend, travels to Cardiff to give her a passport, and they have a little catch-up. And amidst all the sort of hanging out and generally enjoying a bit of downtime in the centre of Cardiff, they discover that Margaret Slitheen, as played by Annette Badland, has been elected mayor of Cardiff, and she's running a rather shady nuclear project. And
in the centre of
yeah. Well, this is something that we might come on to.
Going to demolish Cardiff Castle and
build a nuclear power plant. Yes. Anyway, it's basically the lead-in to, well, not the lead-in. It doesn't lead in directly, but it's almost a sort of calm before the storm episode, if you like, before the finale of the series and the Ninth Doctor's era. I think this was quite well regarded at the time. I think it was quite popular. John, what do you think of Boomtown?
It's interesting, isn't it? We discussed already really how broad how broadly this is played. I mean, the nuclear project is entirely played for laughs, right? They're going to demolish a large swathe of the centre of Cardiff to put a nuclear power station in the middle of it. It's just such a laugh. And
the construction, the green light has gone from, in a couple of months from this is going to happen to construction, which is
yes, which is
does not happen.
No, and I remember. I think there was a video during the Tory Lib Dem coalition government 2010 to 2015, as I recall, there was a video by Nick Clegg saying, we shouldn't go ahead with nuclear because the first of these wouldn't be finished till 2020, and it's like, ugh. Anyway, so that's all played very broadly. There are sort of two key thematic tracks in this, aren't there? Really, there's the possibility of redemption for Margaret Slitheen, played by Annette Badland, in a pretty magnificent performance that has to go from broad comedy through to sort of tragedy, through to discussing like basically having an abusive childhood, and it's a performance that has to go from real broad comedy through to serious drama, and I think she handles that pretty well because it's sort of a.
It demands a lot of the sort of guest turn of the week, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it basically forces the
person... You need
a
proper actor in that role.
Yeah, I mean, it forces the performer to do a handbrake turn every 10 seconds almost. So, there's the possibility of her redemption and so on and so forth. And then there are the various rifts. Obviously, the rift under Cardiff, but more importantly, the rift between Mickey and Rose, and how he feels left out of the gang, and the jealousy, the Doctor's own jealousy about that, which he's trying to sort of keep under wraps.
Yes. And I guess we should probably sort of acknowledge up top that I think this might be the first time we've encountered Mickey or discussed a Mickey story since the sort of incredibly grim allegations were made against Noel Clarke. I have to say, that's... For me, that's what you think about now when Noel Clarke pops up on screen. It's like, oh God, right. But he is in this. He's also in a lot of other Davis-era Doctor Who, so I think let's acknowledge that as being, I'm not going to say a distraction, but as a just another thing this has to bear, I think.
Yeah.
But yes, his character and his relationship with Rose is pretty central to this, isn't it?
It is, and I mean, this is the comedy is broad, the themes are broad. Russell T Davies is not. He's leaning a lot on his soap opera experience, and not Is that Garth Marenghi thing of I know writers who use subtext and they're cowards, and this is kind of there isn't much subtext. Everything that is thematically part of this is basically very clearly on the screen and in the script.
Yeah,
and there's a little bit there. I think that the note in it that I really felt was a bit new and a bit different was when Margaret Blaine is the character's name, but when the Slitheen character played by Annette Badland has a go at the Doctor for always avoiding the consequences of his actions, which is something that recurs again and again throughout Russell T Davies's run on the show, and
Moffat's to an extent.
Yes,
they're both pretty preoccupied with that.
That's right, and I think it's a fair cop. I remember we talked about, obviously, Lewis Baston, a friend of the podcast, who's written a Black Archive book, a very good Black Archive book on Sunmakers. We discussed as well when we reviewed it. There's you foment a revolution and things are kicking off, and you say, right, well, my job here is done. Thanks everybody. It's been emotional, and then sort of get in the TARDIS.
Good luck with building a fully functional society.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So. So it's quite an interesting thing to have that reflected on by another character in the Doctor's presence. But I have to say, for all of the sort of quite broad and well, I mean, this does what it is meant to do, and it is regarded as a kind of quiet classic and proof that the Doctor Who can do these quieter episodes that don't necessarily, that are not necessarily all singing or dancing. It left me a bit cold this time round, I have to say. It felt too slight, and a lot of the emotional beats it was trying to hit, like the Slitheen not killing the pregnant lady or the discussion of the death penalty. It all just felt a bit ham-fisted. I'm all in favour of broad, and I don't mind sort of I don't mind the topics for discussion being very obviously in front of you. There's nothing wrong with that, particularly in a popular drama, but it just felt all a bit too broad too broad, but not too broad, but not too deep.
And it was on the small screen.
It was.
Yeah.
So, Matt, what did you think?
Yeah, I mean, I largely agree. I think I remember feeling this was sort of slightly overpraised at the time, and I stand by that now. I mean, it's doing a few things that are interesting, and that I think the series will continue to do better further down the line. It's the first time I think that Doctor Who has ever really done an episode that's designed to be low on action and high on interrogating and putting under the microscope, the Doctor's guiding principles and, how he operates. It's the first introspective episode of Doctor Who in that regard, ever, like, where the whole point of it is to examine the Doctor and what makes him tick. And I think Davis and Moffat will both do variants on that of, some of greater complexity, some of more drama. I mean, like Love and Monsters the following year, divisive but much better spin, I think, on this kind of idea of, like, what happens to the people who he leaves behind.
Yeah.
And even then, not directly related, but something like Listen in Capaldi's first run, which is essentially, the Doctor sort of essentially trying to scratch an itch and complicating the situation. All of this kind of grows out of this episode where, it's designed to put the Doctor and what makes him tick under the microscope. It's also, it all builds, that the whole thing hangs on that one dinner scene. The point is for them to get to dinner and have that conversation, and it's meant to be a sort of you'll probably be able to name some better archetypes, maybe that sort of Frost Nixon, the sort of the shifting sands, who's up, who's down across a single conversation over dinner. And I think that's obviously what it's trying to do, but it sort of doesn't quite land. I think it's not as interesting or deep as to what it finds. And I think also in setting up potentially an interesting and dramatically fruitful, line of inquiry about the Doctor's morality, it lands on, and this is a criticism that we made last week about Russell T Davies, and a lot of people hate Russell T Davies's work for its Deus Ex Machina endings. I disagree, but here, I mean, it's literally, it's almost like push button. It's kind of resolved. I mean, literally, the ghost, the god comes from the machine, literally at the end, which has the effect,
which comes in handy for him a couple of weeks later as well,
big time. It sort of has the effect of undermining the whole point of the episode, in that the Doctor does get to sidestep very conveniently a lot of the fairly pertinent issues that Margaret Slitheen does raise. It's also, I mean, that dinner scene is about 20 minutes in. I mean, if they'd done it as a sort of midnight, long night of the soul, as a two-hander between the two of them, or, the one-hander that Capaldi gets much further down the line or something, then it might feel that this is kind of, I don't know. I think it's striving towards something that it doesn't really land. It's
that scene could have played longer, I felt.
It could have played longer, and it could have played better. It's like it's sort of weirdly underpowered given the weight of what it's meant to achieve.
I think the problem with it, I felt it could have been longer, and I think that the particular reason why it needed to be longer, that scene, in my view, was that it was just so much of a handbrake turn from the kind of arseholery at the beginning, where she tries to poison the drink and he swaps it, and then she says, I can produce a dart, and then he catches it, and it's all played for laughs. Yeah, that is fun.
But it's also most of that scene.
Yeah, and then by the time they actually get to discussing some sort of philosophical their respective philosophical bona fides. There isn't really enough time to earn the emotional beats they're wanting to hit with them. I did feel never shy from discussing the sort of political context. It's quite interesting.
Here it comes, listeners.
So the Wales Millennium Centre features very prominently in this. It's the huge sweep of a building with writing on it, and the Welsh National Opera is based there, for example, and it's very much wanting to showcase that kind of new Wales, right? And obviously that there was a referendum in, I think, 1997, late 97, in order to form the Welsh Assembly, now the Senedd. And so there was a kind of a feeling that, and especially when it was announced that Doctor Who would be filmed in South Wales for the revival, which obviously hit the screens in 2005, it was part of this whole sort of sense that maybe that Wales was turning a corner and getting more investment and going in a different direction. And the very fact that this is called Boomtown and it's set in that Cardiff, and there's talk about having major infrastructure projects, although absurd ones in this case, being planted there, it sort of feels of a piece with that. And yet, at the same time, you're beginning to get some of that criticism that the new Labour government that was there at the time got quite a lot, that this stuff is sort of happening, but it's happening in a weird way or without consultation, or with dubious sense of where the money is sort of coming from. And obviously this is an era of public-private partnership and private finance initiative stuff where the government was effectively paying over the odds to have this stuff be off balance sheet in a sort of a vain attempt to make it seem as though the public debt wasn't being impacted by these things, but obviously siphoned off a lot of money for corporate interests. And so, there's a kind of background to this sense of, things are getting built, things are becoming shinier.
A flashy regeneration project, for want of a better.
But so that stuff is happening, but is it happening at a cost or
correctly?
And is it happening correctly? So, I think that's the kind of mood music around the whole thing, and it's perfectly reasonable to discuss that subtext when Russell T Davies is, or that context rather, when Russell T Davies is so obviously plugged into the social, economic, political landscape whenever he's writing, and
especially of Wales. I mean, that's
exactly the man is Welsh after all. I thought that's quite interesting as in sort of locating it as a period piece and the issues that it was speaking to, or not even so much speaking to, but reflecting. That was just the context for writing a piece like that. So that was quite interesting. And there were some good lines, especially in the dinner, once in a while you happen to be kind, as the Doctor says, of Annette Badland's decision not to kill the pregnant lady. And I think she retorts at some point that he might as well be a god because of his arrogance and so on and so forth. But I'm left with the impression, basically, it's a slight episode with a couple of decent moments.
I think it's a sort of proof of concept that it's like you can do a Doctor Who episode, or like there's a template somewhere that is, because I mean it is. I don't think you can I don't think you should understate the extent to which this is a departure for the kind of story that you might expect Doctor Who to tell, at least on television. Some of the spin-off media might have gone down this route. I couldn't tell you. But I mean, it's there to sort of say this is the kind of thing that we could do, and I think that kind of thing is done much better later. I do. I mean, there were just a couple of stray points. I mean, we mentioned that Annette Badland is great, and I think the thing that she sort of gets the thing over line to an extent. I do sort of love the fact, and I did feel this in 2005 of going like, this is sort of the thing that you only get from Doctor Who in that final scene where she is giving a very committed performance in the TARDIS, essentially wearing a giant rubber hand. It's like, only Doctor Who would get a sort of a very classy actress like her and make her do this and get her to do it. So it's like this nice touch there.
Yes.
The other thing, I mean, and you talking about it as a sort of time capsule. The other thing that I think it did, I remember feeling it did at the time in the run, is a marker of what an extraordinary learning curve I think everyone was on in making that first series of Doctor Who. In a sense, it's a bit of a mop-up job that, you know, we can film it and use the locations of where we are without having to dress them up as something else.
Yeah.
You know, Cardiff plays itself in this. It makes good on some leftover plot points from The Unquiet Dead, and you get
Aliens of... Oh, and sorry, because they mentioned Gwen, don't they? Sorry,
and also the Rift. That's where that's from.
Yeah.
But then also they don't have to make a new alien; they can get the suits out again at the
yeah,
Slitheen.
exactly. And then riff off that as well.
But the progress with how, I mean, the Slitheen aren't great. I'll be honest. But
I'm quite fond of the design, but I would be lying if I said it was well executed.
Really work. But the execution and sort of capability of, you know, of how they're shot, how they move, the integration of CGI and the physical suits is streets ahead of Aliens of London and World War III.
Yeah.
Yes, which is a real marker of confidence of just like how much they'd learnt on how to do this kind of thing since you know they made, well, those episodes were the very first of modern Doctor Who that got shot. I also think so. Joe Ahern, who directs quite a lot of the second half of the first Eccleston series, is brilliant. I think it's a real shame that he never came back and did anything else subsequently. His hallmark is, I think, those almost sort of aggressively hard close-ups of people's faces, essentially. So in that dinner scene, he goes right in tight on Eccleston and Annette Badland's faces. Is a sort of directorial choice that I think really does make good on making TV of that era. I think there's I remember last week when we had a look at The Sound of Drums, there are bits in that episode where some of the direction is striving for the cinematic, but actually literally like the cameras, you know, it's all being shot on standard definition digital video.
Colin Teague was the director.
Yes, Colin Teague, who, you know, I think did a perfectly decent job. That kind of sort of quasi-cinematic direction comes up short, I think, a lot of the times in those first 4 years before they moved to HD and like you know, much more sort of cinematic lenses and things like that. Whereas Ahern knows he's directing for television and does things that work well on the quote-unquote small screens. It's like those... I mean, it's most prominent as a hallmark in Dalek, where you have the conversation between Eccleston and the Dalek, and you have, you know, tight close-up of Eccleston's face and then a tight close-up of just the eye stalk on the Dalek.
Yeah.
He does that sort of thing really well. And, you know, it gives it some pep, I think, from time to time. I also, the one thing towards the end that it became weirdly reminiscent of for me was the TV movie, where you've got the clouds sort of starting to spiral above the TARDIS, and, you know, there's the, I think, at least implied threat that everything's going to get sucked into the rift and therefore kind of through the TARDIS, which is sitting on top of the rift, which is essentially the threat that is going to happen in the TV movie. That, you know, everything's going to get pulled into the TARDIS. And, yeah, some of those effect shots and how they're put together are quite similar. I just thought, oh yeah, this looks quite a lot like the TV movie. The fact that I'm making that comparison slightly listlessly perhaps suggests that I don't think this amounts to a hill of beans, to be honest. It's like, no. I think it's fine. But I think it's I don't want to accuse it of being too clever, because I think it's a sort of tentative step in the direction for doing a more sort of quirky, introspective episode. So I don't think it's shooting for a cleverness it doesn't quite deliver on, but it sets up a more interesting premise than it actually delivers on, I think.
Yeah, I would agree. I still think
I feel slightly perplexed by this episode, to be honest. Like,
I found it quite difficult to sort of pigeonhole it. I thought that there were some good examples of. I mean, the intro is very, like, just from a technical perspective, the writing of the intro is extremely economical. Like, with Mickey arriving from the train, finding the TARDIS, getting inside, and the three of them, the Rose, Jack, and the Doctor, sort of finishing each other's sentences and all standing to one side while Mickey's on the left-hand side of the shot. Again, Joe Ahern.
It's quite a smug dynamic it sets up with them that sort of more the kind of thing that will really come to the fore in the next series.
Yes.
I think purposely, but also gratingly with Tennant and Rose.
Yeah, but I think it works here, and also it doesn't last very long. It's like about 2 minutes in, you've had all of that, Mickey's arrival and the establishment of the dynamic, and I thought that it was a very good example of something that Russell T Davies is repeatedly good at, which is just economically putting you in the emotional driving seat of the situation. So I thought there are some good moments like that. Decent performances. It's just, I mean, there's just, like I say, I think you were right to say, Matt, it's not like we're accusing him of shooting for something and missing. It's
not like it aims for a profundity and misses widely. It's not pretentious.
No, it isn't. And I think, that's probably what gets it by. But, it doesn't really amount to very much, does it?
Yeah.
There was a vote again tomorrow now to keep the Senedd or get rid of it. How do you vote?
I think I would get rid of it.
Why?
Because, I don't know, I feel they're not doing enough.
What about you, sir? Would you keep it?
I think so, yeah. Why not?
And so, for our second story tonight, we're heading all the way back to season 10.
That's right. So this was this is the Green Death, broadcast between the 19th of May and the 23rd of June, 1973. So
nearly 50 years ago.
Yeah, bang on.
Wowza.
And according to Wikipedia, definitely written by Robert Sloman, but with Barry Letts as an uncredited contributor.
Do you think he had a hand in this, Barry Letts?
It's funny. Yes, I suspect. I mean, I don't know how much Robert Sloman is left in this. So there's a sort of, if the Green Death is, the Green Death seems to me to leave a Barry Letts shaped hole in the wall. So
Barry Letts trail.
Yeah, right. So shall I try to summarise what it's about?
Well, this is one of those ones that sits pretty well in the popular imagination as the one with the maggots, isn't it? If you're going to do
basically
Friends titles, I mean, it's one of the few sort of non-Dalek episodes that might have percolated through to popular memory.
Do you know, it's funny because I often find myself sort of we find ourselves berating the Troughton era for the formulaic and dull base under siege stuff. And actually, this is such a kind of if you were to ask ChatGPT for a Pertwee plot, it would basically be this. It would be shiny new British industrial white heat of technology thing is clearly fucking everything up, and with some shady
with
sinister
monsters.
person, and monsters, sure,
yeah.
So, and that's basically it. I mean, there's a...
Do you know what? But actually, before we get into this, I agree, but I would also make that point that what you're addressing there is the difference between formula and format. In that, yes, I mean, obviously, this ticks a lot of those classic Pertwee bingo boxes, and as did the Sea Devils that we looked at a couple of weeks ago.
But crucially, you see, the difference between this
is a format that
Yes.
is designed to offer a variety of different concerns. It's intentional. Whereas the problem with the Troughton era is that they ostensibly turn up in a different situation every week and just do the same thing.
Yes, and crucially, this is done well.
That also helps.
This, I mean,
not to preempt our thoughts on the Green Death, but
I'm
yes.
happy to preempt, and I'm happy to like. This is absolutely god tier Doctor Who, as far as I'm concerned. This is like up there at the top.
Okay, I was going to work towards this point as being the thing that I would end this review on, but sod it, let's go in early. That
Balls out of the bath.
I think on this viewing, it's now become for me the greatest Doctor Who story ever made.
Yeah.
And I look forward to dissecting that. But yes, okay, we've put our cards on the table before we've even summarised the plot. As if anyone listening to this needs us to summarise the plot of the Green Death.
No,
but
I know.
they turn up to Wales, there's chemicals being pumped down the mine, some miners are turning up, going green. Joe falls in love with the professor of a hippie commune. Turns out there's loads of maggots. Doctor sorts it out, basically.
Well, yeah, and the Brigadier gets to blow some shit up as well.
Yes, yeah, exactly. I mean, the Pertwee bingo card gets it only lacks the master, really, in order to.
Yeah.
So where should we start with? Actually, go on. One thing I will say about the Pertwee bingo card as well is that and this is one of the things you can do when you have a very well-established format. Okay, so we're jumping around all over the place with this, but I like the fact that obviously one of the Pertwee hallmarks is that the man from the Ministry turns up partway through. And in this one, they even announce it in those terms, like, oh, the man from the Ministry is here.
Yeah.
And then the man from Ministry walks in, it's Mike Yates undercover, which is a great switcheroo for the audience.
It really is, yeah.
But they're also, it's an era of Doctor Who that's confident enough to play with its own tropes by that point, that it's like, it's given us such a rogues gallery of fusty civil servants and ambitious ministers by that point, that it plays for quite a nice surprise.
But just to give you a sense of the thematic meat that's on, clearly, for a start, this is a 6-episode serial, 6 25-minute episodes, but so it's inevitably going to get through more material. Most of the 6-parters drag.
Yeah.
This one does not drag at all.
Rattles along.
It's really pacey. And even like, episode 4, you get to episode 4 and stuff is still
No,
really...
I don't think there's an ounce of fat on this. I think it's...
No,
it's
it's truly outstanding.
It's a tight 2.5 hours.
And like with Boomtown, I managed to write sort of half a page of notes. I got 5 pages of notes on the Green
my God.
Death.
Right, okay. Well, look, there's clearly a lot to get into here. I think it's fair to say that this is A, very good, and B, a very rich text where I think we probably need to be quite structured about how we're going to talk about this. So
well, let's talk about
give us an entry point.
Let's talk about the personal relationship side first.
Right.
Because this hinges on the whole thing actually really is the emotional heart of this is Joe leaving the Doctor and shacking up with Professor Jones, and it's sort of like being alongside a mirror, and she's in the kind of middle of that, and then the Doctor and Professor Jones are kind of reflections of each other, and there's so much going on there because the Doctor is kind of like the father figure who's seeing, he talks about the fledgling flying the coop.
Yeah.
But, when Joe
and
then
he
says,
wants to take Joe to Metabilis 3, but it's got that air of almost like a dad going, oh, what do you mean you don't want to come to the park again?
And I don't wish to make this creepy because I'm not suggesting that it's creepy, but there's, Joe says he reminds me of a younger you.
That is a brutal line.
Yeah. And so there's that sense of what might have been if he had been younger or, and obviously there's no suggestion of Pertwee's third Doctor being in any way inappropriate in that sense, but there's a wistfulness that goes with that and seeing himself reflected in Professor Jones, with whom, by the way, he is never at any point so jealous of Professor Jones that he kind of tries to push him away. He actually gets on with him really, really well.
No, and you think actually that brilliant scene where they meet and almost Professor Jones thinks that's where the Doctor's coming from when he says, oh, your paper on whatever was very good for your age. And he says, oh, I'm a promising young whippersnapper, am I? And the Doctor says, no, for the age in which you live.
Yeah.
It's like, which is... he's really saying
it's actually really high praise.
It's incredibly high praise.
Although typical for Pertwee, it doesn't really sound like
no, but it's a great switcheroo.
It is. I mean, there's genuine respect there, and so I think that heart of it is really good. If I have one bum note on that, it's sort of that. And we talked about this in the Sea Devils a couple of weeks ago, but in the Sea Devils, Joe was the driving force of all of the action and very much on the front foot and intelligent and responsive. And in The Green Death, she's a bit more of the ditz that she was first introduced as.
But that's deliberate, isn't it? I mean, it's like the point, her first scene in Terror of the Autons is that she goes in and messes up the Doctor's experiment.
Yeah, exactly.
And she does the same. It's designed to draw that connection.
No, absolutely. And so, like,
But also, it is a bit of a backward step for the character.
It feels it, but I can understand why Barry Letts or potentially Robert Sloman wanted to have that. Again, it's about these reflections, I think, and an echo and the kind of closing of the loop on that. That it works for the story.
Yeah,
that she's doing what she did when she was first introduced. It's just a little bit of a pity for the character because when we've seen her be much more independent and develop, but I guess as well it's to do with the fact that she's falling in love and
I mean that's the thing. I think
she's not necessarily fully in command of her faculties, right?
No, and that all the sort of stupid stuff that she does in this, like for example when she goes to go and get a maggot, and leaves him the note, which is obviously incredibly dangerous and silly thing to do. I think that you can definitely give this production team enough credit to have developed the characters week on week enough for that to be an out of sorts thing for her to do because because she's in love. She's not thinking straight. And it's also, I mean, it's like, not to just praise this for not being as useless as Doctor Who usually is around, the need to write a character out and just tack it on at the end. But it's like, you've got to appreciate the fact that they deliver it in a way that is fully integral to the story, in a way that the modern series tries to do a bit more, but it's like it's there from the off. Something does come into that relationship.
Totally. I
like the sense in those early scenes at Unit HQ. You've got a bit more of the spikiness between the Doctor and the Brigadier as well. There is a slight sense, even though the third Doctor, there's another year of his stories left to come, although obviously Unit plays a smaller and smaller part in that. There's a sense of, like, the band breaking up a bit. Like when, the Doctor's insisting that all three all three characters are at odds with each other slightly in that kind of opening scene. That you've got the Doctor just wants to go off to Metabelius 3 and find his crystal. And then you've got Joe and the Brigadier both wanting to head down to Clan Fairfax, but supposedly on completely opposite sides of the argument. Although it's also one of the things I think is wonderful about this is that the Brigadier is allowed to modify his position.
Yeah, no, the Brigadier allying with the hippies and absolutely not missing a beat on it is fantastic.
Well, this is the thing. Just the delivery of information and dramatic character. Like last week, I slagged off the Underwater Menace, or essentially the thing that I disliked most about the Underwater Menace was the fact that these kind of narrative developments can only happen if everyone was completely stupid, and it's sort of reliant on everyone doing that. Yeah. This takes nothing for granted in terms of how it lays out how people are going to react to things. So at Unit HQ, when Joe says, I want to go down and see Professor Jones, can't you see they've got to be stopped? And the Brigadier says, no, frankly, cheap petrol and lots of it. That's exactly what the country needs. Yeah. But then and he goes down there because he thinks they should be protecting global chemicals. But when he goes in there and he's getting the sales pitch and they say no waste, no pollution, he's immediately sceptical. He smells bullshit and very quickly realizes that there's something else there. So it's, even though his ideological sympathies are probably lean more in their direction.
Yeah.
It doesn't blind him to realising that there's something that needs to be investigated here.
No.
Yeah, then that string of interactions that he has with the people at the... Is it the Nut Hatch or Nut Hutch?
Hutch.
Nut Hutch.
Down to going to dinner with them but deciding to wear black tie.
Yeah.
Which I just think is brilliant.
It's so brilliant. And then he says that he'd rather stay at the pub rather
Yeah.
than sleep over. But that...
Which is like your dad visiting your student digs, isn't it?
I mean...
I could put you up in the corner. Yeah, I'll be okay at the...
Yeah. It's totally that. But it's played so beautifully. But then, again, he has an assumption. He comes from a position, the Brigadier. But it's like, I love that scene where Professor Jones is introducing all of the other people, and it's. I'm sure we'll talk a bit more about the Nut Hutch, the whole wheel community inhabitants in a little more detail in a bit. But when he goes through what everyone's credentials are, that they're not just a bunch of dropouts. They are people who, are here for a reason and like intelligent, credentialed, often very experienced people. He's genuinely bowled over by this, but he's impressed. And then obviously the running gag that like Nancy keeps serving him the fungus that's, eventually...
It is beef.
Yeah.
He insists that it is beef, but like the meat substance. Well, we'll get 1 second. We'll get onto that. But like,
it's so densely interwoven. This you can't start talking about one bit without talking about other bits.
It's really true. But like when Professor Jones is introducing all of those characters. By the way, you've got that's the most varied bunch, right? So you've got mathematicians, engineers, women, people of color, admittedly as supporting artists, but they're there, right? And they're meant to be. That's meant to be reflected the fact that this is a diverse community that's discussing all of these important issues about the future of how we do things. They're not doing it in some sort of anti. They're not just wanting to. They're not just wanting to sort of grow your own vegetable and live in communes. They're wanting to develop scalable technologies that can revolutionize the world.
This is the thing that I think is really interesting in how it... I mean, so my main takeaway of this is that this is a wide-ranging slab of counterculture presented in contemporary Doctor Who.
And quite apart from anything else, when you see that thing about diversity and the youth not being, not misspending their youths, but really engaging with the serious topics of the time and how to forge a seriously sustainable future. It's sort of infuriating to have these kind of debates labelled in this day and age by a certain section, a large section of the media, as somehow very, very new and woke.
Yeah.
When these things were clearly being discussed and fought in earnest 50 years ago.
Yeah.
And it's the same, it's the same stuff being discussed then. The other thing that's really important to recognise is that this is a foundational time for environmentalism becoming a major political concern.
Yeah.
So, and just to give you a sense of how wide-ranging that is, President Nixon, who, no fan of the left, and obviously brought down in terms of his brought down by the Watergate scandal, in which he was bugging his political opponents on supposedly on the centre left and so on.
Yeah. Spoilers.
Yes, right. But he is the one who in the early 1970s actually founded the Environmental Protection Agency and spoke very vividly about the need to regulate against pollution, make sure there was clean water, all the rest of it. Now that was what was happening with a kind of only Nixon could go to China, a massively anti-communist, right-wing president within the United States, although it has to be said that his domestic policy, at least, would these days be classified pretty much to the left, but within American politics anyway. But that's not the point I'm making. The point I'm making is that there was a broad-based interest in environmentalism at this point.
Yeah.
And obviously, what we're seeing represented in the Green Death within the Nut Hutch is clearly on the more left progressive end of that. But the idea that these things only became a concern when people started watching Blue Planet or so on and so forth. Clearly the salience waxed and waned. There was this very big upsurge in the early 70s, then it kind of died back a bit. Then the Green parties began to really emerge in the late 80s, particularly around the fall of the Berlin Wall and the fall of the Iron Curtain, as a kind of, could this be the progressive route to go after the fall of communism, that kind of thing. So it waxes and wanes. But the idea in this day and age that these debates are uniquely new, or that young people are uniquely difficult or uniquely bothered by these things, it's not true. These debates have happened for a very, very long time.
Well, also, I mean, I can't give you a particularly comprehensive précis because I've only just started reading it. But I've just started reading a interesting book by a guy called Matthew Ingram called the full title is "Retreat: How the Counterculture Invented Wellness," which looks to trace how a lot of things, obviously, first and foremost, that come as part of the wellness industry now, which is something I think one should rightly be at least moderately sceptical of, but how a lot of the ideas now that are sort of widely accepted as mainstream and taken for granted find their roots in the counterculture. And I think what the Green Death does really well is to present the counterculture as a forward-thinking, intelligent, and inquiring force that has some intellectual urgency behind it. You go in with the brigadier goes in with the assumption these people are just going to be dropouts and people, who don't understand reality.
Yeah.
And what he actually encounters is quite a urgent and advanced and thoughtful and intelligent consideration of actually how can we build the tools that we might need to live.
Yeah.
And the point that sort of the overall thesis of Ingram's book is to trace all of the different ways in which like a lot of relatively accepted tenets of how we live today have their roots in those movements in the 60s and 70s. So it's generous enough to. Well, I say it's generous enough. I mean, I think a lot of the Doctor Who production team at that point were very rooted in the counterculture, or at least very interested in it.
Not so much Terrance Dicks.
Less so Terrance Dicks. But
although he he hasn't stood in the way of this being someone else's authorial vision. He's just...
Well, no, and this is the thing of like, the thing that we keep coming back to about why this era works so well is that you think of all the key writers and producers. You've got Barry Letts, who's a Buddhist. You've got Terrance Dicks, who is essentially a right-wing imperialist. Maybe painting him with a slightly broad brush there, but he talks about how he thinks the British Empire should have stayed around in some of the DVD extras, so that's fine. Malcolm Hulke, obviously not involved in this, but communist. Bob Baker, Dave Martin, cop to being, I think, plausibly socialists, I think.
A lefty for sure.
Yeah, definitely lefty. Everyone taking a slightly different position across a spectrum of views that you could have. But what comes out of all of that is not a sort of either a centrist mush or anyone particularly getting the upper hand, but an incredibly nuanced and interrogated view of pretty much any situation that is put on screen. And, the Green Death, I think, does that perfectly. To it, like, not even does it present the whole wheel community, the nuthatch types, as being sympathetic and intelligent and forward thinking, but they also are presented as being sort of three-dimensional people within the context of the Welsh community around Llanfairpwll.
Yeah.
So that scene at the beginning where Stevens addresses the miners outside the factory, and he does his "I have in my hand a piece of paper" speech.
Which, by the way, is Chamberlain,
yes.
Obviously. Right down to him saying, wealth in our time.
Yes. So that, and then Stevens and his crew turn up and start protesting that, and they get shouted down by the miners. The miners who raise, the valid and worthwhile point that the whole wheel types have got the privilege and the economic means to drop out. They're not reliant on the jobs that the miners might have from global chemicals.
Yes.
Which is a good point. It's also one that the Jones himself cops to when he says, basically, we're only able to do this because I got the Nobel money.
Yeah.
So, it's a fair point. But then when the first body comes up and it's glowing green, Jones is right in there helping the miners work out what's happening, and they defer to him because he's a doctor, and there's none of that, oh, you're not one of us. It's like he mucks in to help a local who is in trouble. And then right at the end, when Joe pulls off the thing of getting UN funding for the whole wheel community, the first thing that he says is that Jones says is wealth for the valleys. That it's like economically, this isn't just like, oh, I've won, screw you to the the miners or anything. It's like that this will economically enrich the whole region and give it a way forward, having been trapped in this dead-end mining
They
industry.
talk about developing, they talk very openly about, they talk very openly about having renewable energy sources, so, developing windmills and so wind turbines and hydroelectric power and so on and so forth. And again, the thing that I really like is that
the alternative meats as well.
Yeah, well,
meat
that's
substitutes.
it's
incredibly on the nose.
Right, yeah, something that's very much a live concern and a real industry today. It's very interesting that the green movement in this is portrayed as wanting to align with the idea of having scalable technologies that can deliver a good quality of life for a large number of people. So yes, like you say, at the beginning, you've got the middle-class crusties, supposed, and obviously we learn it becomes more nuanced than that, right? But you've got the middle-class crusties on one side and the working class who just want a job on the other. And of course, what happens in that is that the working class end up aligned with the evil conglomerate multinational because the construct that we have, the socioeconomic construct, means that they rely on the evil megacorp to pay their wages, and therefore don't align with those with whom they probably have greater political affinity.
Well, and the people who die are all the miners, and they are killed by the actions of the megacorp.
Working class people killed.
Also, Global Chemicals is quite on the nose as a name for a company, isn't it?
Yeah, but also, like you say, like all the people who die are working class people who die down the mines, which is exactly, and also it's that whole thing of like when it's said at the beginning, coal is a dying industry. It's like, well, yeah, it is a dying industry, and it should die, but at the same time, what then are you going to concern yourself with replacing it with for those people in those communities? And this became a debate that lasted another 11 or 12 years. I mean, the big coal miner strike, Scargill versus Thatcher, is 11 years after this. So, again, it's very focused on the issues of the day, but ones that have sustained so very strongly into the present era, to the extent that you become very sad watching this, that the very intelligent arguments made 50 years ago did not end up embedding themselves more broadly outside of the counterculture.
Well, it's depressingly timely. I mean, this is the thing. It's one of the least dated slabs of 70s Doctor Who that I think it's possible to watch, because it's like the points that it makes with a real sort of heft and urgency and intelligence are still worth making now and making even more urgently. But just possibly moving it beyond the environmental movement, because that is by no means the limit of either this episode's ambitions or
you get all that, but you also get the Doctor in a cherry picker. You also get Venusian Aikido. Yeah. You get Mike Yates jumping off a building.
Well, but
you get.
I'm
all
also
of
going to
that.
say, but it's also not where it's sort of countercultural introspection ends by any means. So you have all of the business with Boss, the giant computer that's running the show, that has, I believe, managed to become semi-sentient through skillful programming and modelling on human thought patterns.
Yeah,
which, you made a joke earlier about ChatGPT, but this is like way ahead of the curve in terms of the debate of AI and how AI might work in terms of emulating the inefficiencies of the human thought process rather than perfecting, a computer model.
And also, it does seem to have turned into a kind of snarky, outright bro.
Well, but do you remember this happened a couple of years ago that Microsoft launched, some researchers at Microsoft launched an experimental bot on Twitter that was, fully self-sustaining AI trained on interactions it would see on Twitter.
Yeah.
And within hours, it had become completely anti-Semitic and racist, and they had to pull the plug on the whole thing because it was just churning out like absolutely obscene stuff. So the idea that, but I'm also worth pointing out, is it John Dirth as the voice of Boss?
Oh my God.
Also Lupton.
A
year later.
Funny.
What
I hadn't clocked that.
Clearly a phenomenal actor, but a phenomenal performance as the voice of Boss. I mean, that really lifts it a stage above. But there's a fascinating... I think perhaps in another story, I might consider this a bit of a read as a subtext. But knowing what we know about, Barry Letts especially, there's a fascinating discussion within Boss about the nature of consciousness really and what it is to be truly alive.
Yeah,
and at one point the Doctor, when he says that, was it, if I told you that the next thing that I say would be a lie, but the previous thing would be true, would you believe me? Which is kind of a paradox, which is essentially almost a bit like a koan from the Rinzai school of Zen Buddhism, which obviously we know that Barry Letts was a Buddhist, and the Rinzai school puts a huge amount of energy into studying these koans, which essentially, obviously the most famous one is what is the sound of one hand clapping, and the idea is they're these sort of nonsensical non sequiturs. Yeah, John. Oh, there you go. Cracked it.
The things I can do.
Thousands of years of, well, not thousands, but
the things I can do with my hands.
But the point of a koan is that it's designed to fatigue. Quote from a book I read. It's designed to fatigue the logical mind and therefore open up different ways of viewing a situation, which is completely what the Doctor throws in front of Boss, essentially, in order to do that.
True.
And it's like, wow, okay, that's there. And then so I was starting to think, like, oh, is this too much of a read? But then he starts pulling out a crystal and waving it in front of people in order to offer them mental clarity, which is like, okay, we're doing crystal healing as well now.
Yeah.
It's like it's almost like they've decided to pack all aspects of countercultural thought into one. I mean, it's an incredibly dense.
The Gathering, it is incredibly dense, and it's very much to the credit of everybody.
I don't think it's stretching too far to say.
No, it isn't. It isn't at all. The whole section of the Doctor getting that crystal on Metebelis 3 is fascinating.
Well, then the payoff of it, if you want Buddhist subtext in Doctor Who, obviously, the return to Metebelis 3 a year later, where the Doctor has to sacrifice his ego in order to achieve self-realisation, which is like essentially the core of Buddhist teaching.
Yeah, exactly. But he gives into his arrogance, going and chasing. He almost gets himself killed. He, breaks one of his lovely jackets. Going to Metebelis 3 to get this blue sapphire,
this trinket,
and it's which, by the way, he passes off as his wedding present to to Joe at the end. Oh, yeah,
Sorry,
I got you this.
Can we also I just want to reference, I love that bit where the Doctor gets back from Metebelis 3 and he bursts into the room, the phone's ringing, he says, "I'll speak to anyone."
Yes, I know.
Such a funny line, that.
Yes, another bit that made me laugh in the same episode is the bit where Joe and the Doctor, and they do this quite a bit, but like where they both say the same thing. They say, "Never listen to a word I say," and then genuinely chuckle at each other. It's just so sweet the way that their evident real life chemistry just comes through so well on screen. They're such good pals. Really, really appreciated seeing that on screen. I think the whole thing as well is beautifully shot.
Michael Bryant again.
Yeah, Michael Bryant does an amazing job. I mean, there's one shot of them, of Bessie going through to the coal mine, and it's shot through the lift drive wheel from way up high. And you wouldn't have needed to do that, but it was just very dynamic and ace. And there's
some really dynamic camera angles he pulls out later as well, like when the sort of various global chemicals people are being programmed and then sent in to do what they need to do, and the sort of like high up sort of crane angles that lower down. It's very, and that also, I mean, like a lot of those sort of what you might call trippier scenes of, you know, either people being hypnotized or having their minds cleansed by the crystal and stuff. All of that stuff is really well handled.
Yeah, and when Stevens is basically right at the end, when Stevens is sort of about to die, basically, and is organizing the basically his mind turns, and he's got the doctor has the crystal, and he turns and he eventually sets it up so that the whole thing will explode.
Yeah.
And it goes from being massively psychedelic through to being crazy, and it's all just very
Boss is screaming, "Stevens, my friend," and all of that.
Yeah, it's
like
so
it's
bizarre.
Wild.
Yeah, it's really wild. I mean, it's properly like avant-garde. It's so out there. It's really creepy when he's shouting, "Stevens, my friend." And
it's
having been sort of singing Wagner and discussing, you know, Nietzsche and all that sort of "Der Tag is at hand" and all that. God. Anyway, but just back to the direction though, like from those kind of big moments as well to the more tender ones, like when they tell Jo that Bert the miner, who'd helped her so much, had died, they do a close up of Professor Jones touching Jo's hand, and then it cuts to the doctor touching her shoulder as well. It's that thing of again, it's that.
It's not taken for granted, is it? It's
no.
like all that means. Although, if you're talking tender moments, I mean, Jesus Christ, it's like I am not ashamed to admit that I genuinely cried at the end of this time around. It's like
when they kiss.
Well, it's absolutely.
Or do you mean Pertwee by himself?
Pertwee by himself,
Yeah.
like how that, or just, I mean, because Katie Manning's so good in that scene as well.
Yeah.
But, I mean, Pertwee breaks your goddamn heart in that scene. I mean, it is unbelievable. Just the little looks, him not able to make eye contact, downing the champagne, and then the really like way longer than it needs to be shot of him walking slowly out of the building towards Bessie.
Yeah, but
and
also
the way he just sits in the car for a moment before.
But when
he
she
drives
leaves,
off.
and when he leaves, and she's the only one who
clocks that,
and she does.
Yeah,
yeah.
It's absolutely heartbreaking, and it's like that is such a testament to what I mean, yeah, we say this every time Pertwee rolls around, but he's brilliant, and he's fully committed, and you know he can
real range as well.
Well, this is the thing. I mean, even a crap Pertwee episode, he can sell you shit if he needs to through his sheer conviction. So give him something to do dramatic here, and it's like, yeah, he breaks your heart at the end. That is a man who has just been, you know, well, he's had his heart broken, hasn't he?
Yeah, exactly.
And like you feel it, it's devastating.
But you also get him dressed as as Doris the cleaner
and the milkman.
Yeah, and the milkman.
The milkman with the tash playing the...
I mean, this is very much playing into the sort of, James Bond meets Sherlock Holmes.
Yeah.
Sherlock Holmes is always the kind of master of disguise in that. And the disguises are fantastic. And it is very funny when Yates finds him dressed as the cleaning lady. And he says, "Not one word," or something like that.
Says, "I like your handbag." The interplay, like... Richard Franklin as Mike Yates is great. In this
he's having a hoot, isn't he?
Yeah,
having a whale of a time. Yeah. No, it's really quite something. And again, you know, like, when they're finally worked out that it's the kind of meat substitute stuff that can kill off the maggots, and they're sort of like they go around in Bessie distributing it, and you've got Benson going din dins, and then the doctor says, "Sergeant Benson." And it's just like they have a moment for a really crappy joke like that in the midst of all this that's dealing with environmentalism, industrial policy, class-based politics, psychedelia, the counterculture,
the nature of consciousness,
capitalism. I mean, you know, the whole sort of drive for efficiency, the need to be inefficient in order to be creative. Driving profit for global chemicals. What's best for global chemicals is best for the world.
Yeah.
You know, that kind of very corporatist agenda. But what I really like about Boss, the AI computer, is just how cantankerous it is.
Yeah.
Just how mannered, and like you say, it's such a great vocal performance. But the other thing I really wanted to pay tribute to was the awesome Global Chemicals logo.
Yeah.
I am definitely getting that on a t-shirt. Everything is, and when they
surely someone's put up a Redbubble site where you can get that.
I think Clayton, what's his name?
Clayton Hickman.
He'll have done it.
Yeah.
It'll be up there. If not, anyway, but and also in episode 4, you get these when you finally get into Boss's room.
Yeah,
the consoles.
Oh,
I mean, just
heaven.
Beautiful consoles.
Yeah,
I mean,
whirring tapes.
I know, and just the way they're shot and lingering looks on them and that sort of thing. It's just, oh my god.
Yeah, and there's so much of it as well. So obviously that cliffhanger where he says, I am the boss. I am the computer. I'm all around you. And it's also, that's meant to be, conceptually. But also physically, it is all around him.
Yes.
It's like lining every wall and stuff. It's
absolutely.
It's beautifully
and
played.
also the thing to represent, the voice line to represent...
Yeah.
What do you call that? There's probably a proper word.
Waveform.
Waveform. The waveform
I'm looking at one
monitor.
right now.
The waveform. That's no way to talk about your best friend. Anyway, he's not here. But the waveform.
John, when I can replace you with an AI, the show will get a lot easier.
Touche. But yeah, the waveform thing is just beautifully rendered, and a good way of just visually cueing the viewer that is a character, that is a thing speaking.
It's a great way to give you something to look at rather than it just being a voice.
It's just a very clever bit of telly, right? How
great. I mean, oddly, the last time that they've tried to do, it may not be the last time, but the other example that sticks out of the sort of sentient AI computer thing is Votan in the War Machines.
Yeah.
Which similarly is an episode that plants itself very much in a whole bunch of contemporary issues of the day in a way that seems quite striking for Doctor Who to do. But still, it's got that very sort of mannered, this is a computer voice kind of thing going on, sinister as it is. Whereas to just get an actor to do a performance as Boss, and, there's all, like, was he quote Nietzsche and keeps referring to Stevens as my little Superman? It's like, it's so good. It's so creepy.
It is very creepy. And there are lots of, the kind of... when there's quite a few references to kind of the supposed intellectual foundations of Nazism, the Wagner stuff and references of Nietzsche, the Superman, as you said, and obviously the Nazi war machine, the Nazi government was very, very much in cahoots with big industrial players. I mean, very famously, IG Farben, the chemicals manufacturer, was a pretty central to the Nazi war machine. And obviously, this is Global Chemicals, so there's some sort of alignment in the forces that are against our countercultural friends and the chaps from UNIT. I think it's really interesting, just to come back to a point you made earlier about the alliance between, the way that the Brigadier's motivations and alliances and allegiances shift, is that he ends up having far more in common with the dignity and seriousness and sense of duty of those who are trying to build the better world than the bureaucrats and representatives of global capital who are supposedly, part of the same network as him, but actually his personal sense of dignity is better served by working with those people. And indeed,
we see the government in this, don't we? And we see Jeremy, the Prime Minister, over his shoulder, which again is sort of a bit more of a subversion. Well, it's not a subversion, but it goes a stage further than we've seen the show do.
And this is very funny, the reference to Jeremy, because of course Jeremy Thorpe was the leader of the Liberal Party at the time.
Yeah.
And this was a period of particular popularity for the Liberal Party. Indeed, in the first 1974 election, they saw a decent, a very decent. Well, they got a good number of votes, but obviously in our first past the post system, they didn't get a huge number of MPs. But this was a point when the Liberals were riding high in the polls, and before the scandals around Jeremy Thorpe had become public knowledge. So it was very interesting. A nice production joke that they had posited the election of a Liberal leading government, given the circumstances at the time.
There's also actually, sorry, just mentioning, some of the supporting characters and where the dignity lies and how people deal with that. Another character that I'm not sure if he's particularly interesting, but I quite like, is Elgin, who is the guy who's working for Global Chemicals, but he is also the one who sort of smells a rat that there's something going on, and he helps the various people out. I mainly like his absolutely groovy pencil tash and Michael Caine specs, which I think really very clearly situates him in 1973. But again, he's another person who has his own point of view in that system. I mean, it's like, he's obviously has some excitement about the technological mission that Global Chemicals might be on, but what he hasn't done is either, succumb to hypnosis or completely drunk the Kool-Aid to the extent that he's, prepared to see the company do anything.
No, and it's really noticeable that he is just generationally that bit younger than the other executives.
Yeah.
So there's more likely to be a sort of a line of continuity between him and the other sort of counterculture members in Professor Jones's gang.
Sort of like one of those people you went to university with who's sort of doing something wildly different, but you recognise you came from the same place.
Yeah, exactly. Or like, it doesn't involve going to university so much, but it's the Rodney Bewes character in Whatever Happened to the Likely Lads.
Oh yeah,
and gone from one thing to another, or sort of ended up in a. I think that's absolutely right. I think. Look, I mean, this is just first class Doctor Who. It runs the gamut. From extremely funny through to scary. I mean, and even the. We talk about the Lonely God stuff with the later Russell T Davies era. Like Waters of Mars, the Time Lord Victorious, and the arrogance of that, and you see that here in the Doctor going to Metabilis 3. He's really bad on his own.
Yeah,
he needs to come back and be with people, like you said. They make a joke of it. I'll talk to anyone, but he without a word being said, because the whole thing is basically a mime. That whole bit on Metabilis 3 is how he's bad. He would be bad on his own. He needs someone.
It's a disaster.
It's a disaster, but
absolute disaster.
But it's an arrogant disaster. It's full of I'm going to go and do this, and as you say, there's a brilliant from a kind of story arc perspective. This is we finished this story with Planet of the Spiders, which is, by the way, another one that we loved. But yeah, this is absolutely Premier League top tier Doctor Who. I mean, it's just. What else can you say? I mean, it's fantastic.
Each of us all across this great land has a stake in maintaining and improving environmental quality, clean air and clean water, the wise use of our land, the protection of wildlife and natural beauty, parks for all to enjoy. These are part of the birthright of every American. To guarantee that birthright, we must act, and act decisively. It is literally now or never.
Well, there we go. We're getting towards the end of another episode of I'll Explain Later. Christ, the Green Death is good, isn't it?
Yeah.
But to move something less good, the conversation we're about to have. No, this format point. For this week's question of the week, inspired by the Green Death.
We do need a jingle.
Yeah.
I think if we're going to continue with this, we need a jingle.
Right, it's going to be me that writes it, isn't it? So
that's why I'm looking at you.
Thank you for adding to my to-do list. But for this week's question of the week, I asked you, John, based on the fact that the Green Death is... I'm not saying it could have been made yesterday, but its concerns are...
I mean, it wasn't.
No, it wasn't. It was made 50 years ago. But it's so timely, it's so on the nose in terms of, you know, what it's looking to unpack. And, you know, even... Well, no, I'm going to start talking about the Green Death again. I think everyone said enough of that. But anyway, it's fair to say that its concerns have aged incredibly well. And so I wanted to know what other Doctor Who adventures feel either prescient or their concerns or interests feel particularly timely now. What do you got?
Well, two immediately came to mind, and I thought it was very interesting that when you posed this question, I felt like, yeah, my mind immediately alighted onto Hartnell-era stories. So going almost like the furthest way back to get to something that I felt was relevant to our day. The first one I thought of was the Aztecs, because the questions around cultural relativism that it raised became so very, very live and important sort of in the years around the War on Terror, and whether you could impose democracy at the barrel of a gun, down the barrel of a gun. And I felt like those questions of whether it is better to intervene or not intervene, whether things should be allowed to run their course or whether they require intervention, what your moral duties are in that regard. The Aztecs covers all of that in a kids show that manages also to have human sacrifice and people fighting and you know, just
fight scenes.
Yeah, I think it's brilliant in that regard, and so that's one I think that really stands the test of time. But that's not my choice pick. My top pick is The Rescue, which we have reviewed before, as we have also reviewed the Aztecs, and and I just think that, you know, to be watching a piece of telly from 1965 that was basically a two-parter written by David Whittaker to just get Vicky introduced into the cast and move on, and for it to be such a rich exploration of abusive relationships and coercive control, in that case by Bennett, who was, spoilers everyone, from, you know, 57 years ago, 58 years ago, but, you know, he was also doubling up as Coquillian. But that whole aspect around the abusive relationship and coercive control of Vicky, I think that is sadly all too relevant in this day and age.
Yeah, I mean, obviously I mean, I think that was a story that kind of slightly came out of left field and really surprised us when we watched it first time around. But it's a fascinating slice of issues drama dressed up as something completely different.
Yeah,
so it's like dressed up as a murder mystery in a way.
Right down to the parlour room Poirot-esque reveal at the end.
Yes.
Yeah. No, I would urge anyone who has not, I mean, the likelihood of anyone listening to this who hasn't seen The Rescue is very, but if anybody hasn't, it's a really good way to spend 50 minutes, I'd say.
Yeah. I'm also going to go with a story that we've reviewed before. I'm going to go with Vengeance on Barrows, which I don't really know where it sort of stands in the pantheon. I mean, for a long time it was regarded as probably one of the better ones one of the best of a bad bunch, but its prescience for so long was seen as something to do with how it looks forward to the era of reality TV. No, it was commentary on the video nasty era that then sort of started to look forward towards the era of reality TV. But yeah, and I mean, go back and listen to our old episode if you want to hear us expound on this in more detail. I won't repeat it too much, but it was like watching it in a sort of post-Trump, post-Brexit kind of context. You know, especially I thought it was like super Brexity essentially, in that it's all about the perils of direct democracy, and if you hand essentially every aspect of decision-making over policy to a referendum run by populist chances, things are going to come unstuck very rapidly, and unpacks that idea in a way that feels informative now, and it's sort of a morally repugnant slice of Doctor Who, but it's a fascinating piece of TV. I'm also going to give an honourable mention to the episode that we watched last week, actually, The Sound of Drums. Just because watching it, for last week's, we touched on this briefly, but I just made a note around a lot of the stuff around Harold Saxon, and just sort of vague sense where people say, "Oh, I was going to vote for him," and the Doctor says, "Why?" And Martha says, "Well, I don't know. I just kind of liked him, really." And I wrote, "Oh, John, it's a Johnson gag," and then it was like, "Oh no, this is years earlier. This is 2007." So that's got something to say about it. I think, as we discussed last week, there was also a lot of other stuff in the water that was drawing on. It didn't exactly come from nowhere. But yeah, Vengeance on Varos, my pick for that.
And I suppose if we were to flip that coin, what are the ones that have aged badly in terms of the issues that they've raised, or the take that it's kind of generally lent you towards?
Yeah. That's one I'm going to throw out to the listeners, because I'm genuinely not sure. And I think more broadly, it's one of the things that's really surprising about classic Doctor Who is there's very little of it that has to go out with a health warning now, in the sense that, when they repackage old Looney Tunes cartoons or Tom and Jerry ones, and about half of them have got a disclaimer on the front that says this reflects attitudes that are unacceptable today, and sort of historicise it. Obviously, I believe the Blu-ray reissue of Talons of Weng Jiang has one of those disclaimers on it now, and I think there's a lot of hand-wringing about that in certain fan circles, but I think, as we said at the time when we reviewed it, it's not just the yellow face casting that's pretty complex for that, but the fact that it is the only Doctor Who story, to my knowledge, that actively villainises an ethnic group. It's the Chinese are very openly said to be untrustworthy and villainous. So apart from that one,
I can think of some. I can think of
some stuff necessarily maybe that you wouldn't do today, but in terms of a lot of it,
I can think of some clumsy examples.
Yeah,
that sort of just don't work.
There's a lot of old Doctor Who that's not very good.
No. But what I mean is, and I was actually thinking about modern Doctor Who. Famously, the Unquiet Dead ends up being accidentally scathing about asylum seekers.
Yes, and Kablam as well.
And that was the other one I was going to mention, where the Doctor ends up siding with the Megacorp against the oppressed workers, and sort of arguing that the fact that they get half an hour off on Thursdays means we'll chalk that as a win, guys. So I feel like there's a couple that have aged badly because they've accidentally painted themselves largely.
Oh God, and also Spyfall, where she deliberately leaves a non-white incarnation of the Master to be murdered by Nazis.
By the
SS. Makes a joke about it. Yes.
Yeah. Although she does know that he could, he'll, So you escaped from
Castrovalva.
Insert name of last place Doctor Master was seen. But no, you're right. That wasn't.
There's got to be one we're missing here. So as part of our usual, now weekly pitch for correspondence, do get in touch. And
of course, there is we some years ago we released an episode of I'll Explain Later on the 1st of April, and we did have our review of Doctor Who and the Zulus.
Yeah.
Which.
Yeah, that one's still out there. You can dig that out.
Yeah.
But anyway, look, write to us on this or any other matters that you care to take up with us, because we'd love to hear from you. You can contact John via Twitter on @explainlaterpod, or you can email me hello@I'llExplainLater, spelt illexplainlater.com. And we'll be back next week with more stories to review. Are we going to do a preview of what we're talking about next week?
If you are able to conjure it quickly,
oh god,
then we will do a preview.
Yeah. Hang on, where's the spreadsheet?
But I think what we will continue with the question.
This is good filling. Thanks.
We will continue.
Here we go.
We will continue with the question of the week format, and maybe that's something that we should
Yes.
share on social media ahead of time.
So next week it's the holiday special where we'll be looking at Delta and the Bannermen and the Girl Who Waited.
When we say holiday special, we should stress that we don't mean that in a kind of Star Wars holiday special.
No.
There's nothing to do with
absolutely.
the festive period.
Quite the opposite. I think there'll be nothing celebratory about this episode at all whatsoever. I mean, episodes that portray holidays. There you go.
Okay.
He reached for the themes for some of these ones. Anyway, Delta and the Bannerman and the Girl Who Waited next week.
Can't wait.
Good stuff. All right. Well, as always, thanks so much for listening. We'll be back next week. See you then.
Ta-ra.